All right, so Intro to Fusion 360. This is a startup shell workshop made by JMakes 3D, and I'm Jacob. All right, so Intro to Fusion 360. First thing, do you have Fusion 360?
Yes.
All right, so for anyone who doesn't have Fusion 360, this is the link for where to get Fusion 360, and Fusion 360 offers both free personal and educational licenses that renew every year. Last year, they changed the licensing conditions a little bit, but they have said they're committed to having those free options that are available for people. So if you are interested in learning 3D design or interested in using a software that's pretty close to professional for free, Fusion 360 is a great option. And if you decide to use it for professional stuff, it's fairly cheap. So $500 a year doesn't sound cheap, but when you compare it to other software like SolidWorks or Inventor, it is actually pretty cheap. I don't get anything from Autodesk. I just really like their software, and that's why we're doing this talk about it. All right. So let's get started. Here are all the things that we're going to be covering today. How does Fusion 360 work? Sketches, features, and then making a thing. So let's get started with terminology. Or the file system and terminology related to the file system. So we have teams, and I have Fusion 360 here. So this is the upper level workspace. So I'm in the JMakes 3D team. And then you have all your projects. So projects are what you're going to share with other people. If you want to have components, files, anything like that interact with one another, they're going to need to be in the same project as one another. So we're going to go into the side project workshops. And another thing to point out with projects is when you're done a project, you can archive it. That way your team workspace doesn't get cluttered. Now onto folders. So folders work just like folders on your computer. They allow you to organize stuff. So I'm going to go into intro. Starting with uploading files. So uploading is a super powerful tool in Fusion because Fusion can take all types of different files. And we can just click upload here, and then we can either select files or drag and drop. And if you want to upload a file and then use it, you have to upload it first because Fusion 360 is a cloud software. So all of your files are saved in the cloud. For some people, you may have a security or a data protection concern, and Fusion 360 may not be for you if you have that, but for a lot of people, it's totally fine, and the cloud aspects of Fusion 360 can be really useful if you're switching between lots of different computers, if you want to be able to display the data you have on your phone, if you want to be able to really easily share the data that you're looking at with other people. So we're going to go ahead and just click on these in order to open up these files. And then we're going to create a new empty file as well. So we'll bring that off to the side. All right, workspace terminology. So I'll bring Fusion back in over here. So in Fusion 360, there's a bunch of terminology that you're going to want to know so that when you're asking for help or when you're looking for how to do something, you can find the help that you need. So the first thing is the browser. So this is where you're going to have components, and then inside components, you're going to have bodies, sketches, constructions, analysis, anything else like that. The timeline is at the bottom of the window, and this is where all of your features. You can hit play on the timeline. It can go through everything that you did. So the timeline is super powerful tool. And if you want to go back and edit stuff, you just drag this through the timeline, and then you can edit whatever you did at that point. The view cube. So the view cube is great for rotation if you don't have a 3-button mouse. You can just click on it and drag it around and rotate your object. If you also want a very specific view, you can click on a corner or an edge or a face, and the view cube will give you that. So workspaces. Fusion 360 splits up the way you interact with your part into workspaces. So design, and they have little descriptions for all of them, but that's making your basic part, and that's like the traditional CAD stuff. Generative design is something that's with the paid version of Fusion 360, and that allows you to do essentially a bunch of simulations all at the same time, and then it gives you optimized geometry that meets your manufacturing and functional constraints. Render is a really cool workspace because it lets you make stuff that's pretty, and we'll come back into the render workspace a little bit near the end of the workshop. And then animation workspace. The animation workspace is pretty simple in Fusion 360, and if you're interested in doing especially longer animation, I would recommend looking into other software, because Fusion 360 just isn't great at that right now, but it does have basic animation functionality. Simulation allows you to do a lot of different things, so static stress, thermal, structural buckling, shape optimization. Some of these can be done locally, some of them cannot. Manufacture is for doing stuff like machining, as well as some 3D printing. And then drawing is for drafting plans or like laying out plans. So we're going to be doing basically everything in the design space. Inside a workspace, you'll have toolbars. So toolbars are at the top of the window. In this case, we have solid, surface, sheet metal, and tools. Names are kind of intuitive. Inside the solid workspace, you're working with solids. Inside the surface workspace, you're working with surfaces, sheet metal for sheet metal, and then tools are all the other stuff you'd want to do. So you have all the inspection tools here as well as in the other spaces. You have utility stuff, you have scripts, and then you have stuff like 3D printing. So that is the terminology of the workspaces. So now interacting with the workspace. So rotation is one of the things you're going to do most often when you're working in 3D, because you want to be able to see multiple views of your part. And to do that, you just hold down Shift and then scroll wheel, click and hold, and then that lets you rotate the part in 3D. If you're already used to a different 3D software, you can open up Preferences, and Fusion, Alias, Inventor, SolidWorks, and Tinkercad are all here, and you can just switch to that way of rotating, or rotating, zooming, and orbiting. Zooming, also pretty intuitive, is just scroll wheel. Zoom to fit, or pan, is side-to-side motion. And then zoom to fit is another great thing. So let's say your part is something like that. You're zoomed out, or you have other weird stuff that's happening. If you double-click the scroll wheel, it'll zoom in right to your part. And then something else that's super great for when you're interacting with the workspace is, let's say you want to select the face on the back side of this. So if you just click, that selects this front face. But if you do a long left click, it allows you to select everything. And if you have, a lot of stuff happening, so look, if I get this corner, you can see I can select everything that's in the path of where my mouse was. It also lets you select the different levels. So I can select the corner or the body or the entire component. And then sketches. So sketches are the basis for almost all 3D solid body modeling. So that's stuff like Inventor, SolidWorks, Fusion, that type of thing. Sketches are primarily going to be made of 2D lines, arcs, and splines, which we use to make 3D objects. Sketches can be created on the original planes, that's like X, Y, Y, Z, and ZX, on faces, so this is the face of a part, or on constructed planes. And we'll reopen Fusion. So we have construct here, and we can construct all sorts of stuff. And each one has a description for what it does and what it needs to be able to construct things off from it. More on sketches. So sketches can be dimensioned. The shortcut for this is D, and that will bring you into the dimension tool. And the 3 primary dimensions that you do is a direct distance, so saying this is 20 long, this is 10 long, this is 20 long. An offset dimension, so saying between these two, there's a certain number. Or an angle dimension. So same between these two lines is 60 degrees. Sketches can also be constrained. So when you combine constraints and dimensions, you can make really complicated geometry that is defined by just a few numbers at its core. Examples of constraints are stuff like making lines parallel, making circles concentric, or making a line tangent to an arc. And there's a whole list of constraints. So jumping back into Fusion, if I do create sketch and click on the top of this part, and then do line and create a triangle here, I can start adding some constraints to it. So I'm going to make these two parallel. And when you're in the sketch workspace or the sketch toolbar, you can see that you can either click on the constraints here, or you can click on applicable sketch geometry, so like 2 points, and then I can say horizontal. You can also click on 2 things and then hit the shortcut key D in order to bring up the dimension tool. So in this case, I'm going to say I want these to be 3 millimeters apart. Here, we're going to do this as a horizontal vertical. I'll add a perpendicular to that corner, and then I'll go ahead and take this and make these tangent. So you can add a lot of different constraints, and you'll notice that the part changed from blue lines to having black lines. We're going to talk about that more, but that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're working in Fusion. The color of your lines in your sketch has meaning. So we'll finish that sketch. So now sketches. Sketch geometry, colors, and markings have meanings. So a dashed line is construction geometry. These make it easier to constrain sketches, and they don't break up a profile. So when you go to create something with the profile, it doesn't get in the way. An example of this is this construction line going this way. So you can see there's a solid blue line here, but a construction line here. If I only want to select half of this rectangle, I can do that. If I wanted to select in quarter chunks, then I'd want to have this be a solid line. But because I only want to select half, I want it to be a construction line. Especially when you have complicated geometry, you could have many, many overlapping lines. And then if they weren't construction geometry, you'd have to select, 20 different small profile regions when you really just want to work with the whole thing. Then we have the blue lines, or orange for construction. These are non-fully constrained geometry. So most things are going to start out as non-fully constrained. And that's the lines up here. In opposition to that is fully constrained geometry, which is black. That's really good. What black geometry means is that there's no other way to change the part. You can't, move a point while meeting all your constraints and dimensions. So like if I deleted this 20 dimension, I'd be able to move this up and down and all over the place. So you really want all of your sketches to be fully constrained. And I'll go back into here. So if we look at our sketches, you can see some of them have locks on them and some of them have this little pencil on it. What the lock means is that the sketch is fully constrained. What the pencil means is that the sketch is not fully constrained. So it's something that's important to keep in mind, especially early on in a part or when you're making something as just a quick thing. You can have not fully constrained geometry, but good practice is, as much as possible, make everything fully constrained. That way, nothing is left up to chance. Then sketch color. So all the white area around your parts is not a closed profile. And in this case, because this is construction geometry, it doesn't close off this part. So this is also not a closed profile. Light blue means that it is a closed profile. So in this case, you can see these are all closed profiles. And that means that you can select it for use in other features. Here is dark blue. This means you've selected that profile. More on sketches, so more colors. Purple. Purple means the geometry is referencing something outside the sketch. This could be a body, a face, construction geometry, or even another sketch. It's best practice to avoid projecting, intersecting, that type of thing, having this reference geometry, because if something changes in what you're referencing, you can end up breaking your sketch. That gives us yellow and red color. So something went wrong. Either dimensions or constraints can't be solved, or your reference geometry was lost. So a good example of that is up here, we have a sketch which has two different things in it. So this entire outline comes from the back face of this part, and then these 4 lines going down come from these sharp corners. When we round the sharp corners here, you can see all of those lines turn yellow, while the rectangle that was referencing the side is still there. So as well as just trying to avoid it in general, sometimes you do have to use it, but try to make sure you select and reference things that are likely to be more robust in your part, rather than something that you know you may be getting rid of in the future. And then last but not least is green. So green is fixed geometry. You're just telling Fusion 360 that you want that thing to just stay there. This is another one of those things where you should avoid this when possible. Because you didn't define it, you didn't say this is 10 millimeters, this is at this spot, it's kind of up in the air, and you should be able to achieve similar things by just dimensioning and constraining your parts. There are really 2 cases this is useful. The first one is if you haven't fully constrained your sketch and stuff is moving around that you don't want to move around, you can use geometry fixing in order to freeze certain parts of the sketch and see what's still able to move. You can also use this when you're making more artistic pieces, that if you have a bunch of arcs or splines or other stuff that it just needs to look like the art style that you're going after, but it doesn't need to be exact numbers, fixing can be good to make sure that those things don't change. So in order to make these geometries, I'll do a quick example. So let's do project. So project, we can grab this point down here. Now you can see I have a purple dot in this sketch. And then for fixed geometry, I can delete this corner constraint. So this is now free, and then I can just do fix and it's green. If I don't want it to be fixed, I can do that. We'll go ahead and make this perpendicular again, and then finish sketch. So that's the colors and what they mean. Now onto some other general tips for sketching. It's most often better to add fillets and chamfers as features rather than the sketch. So we'll talk more about fillets and chamfers, but for anyone who doesn't know, a fillet is when you round a corner off, and a chamfer is when you add just a straight edge to a corner. As you can see, this is just a rectangle. This is a rectangle that has fillets added it in the sketch. You can see that these construction lines now go past the edge of your part. You can see that we now have 4 dimensions we need to keep track of for our radiuses of the fillet. And you'll get this when you try to do it, that constraints or dimensions were removed during the operation. So what it's best to do is to make, most of the time it's best to do, is to make your stuff without fillets, and then once it's in 3D, you can apply the fillets to all the edges really easily. And then going over it again, long left click opens the depth menu. So this lets you select overlapping things and is super useful, especially once you get to work with complex parts. On to creation features. So the 2 big creation features are extrude and revolve. Extrude is bringing material out of a profile straight from the 2D profile that you have. And then revolve is rotating a profile around an axis. And here are examples of extrude and revolve. You can do other stuff with this. So like on extrude, you can have it at an angle. For revolve, you don't have to go all the way around. You can also cut, join, or intersect bodies. So join is pretty intuitive. That's just whatever you have plus whatever you're adding. For cut, that's taking material away. And then intersect is just wherever the 2 parts meet. Some other creation features are loft and sweep. We won't really go over them in this, but they're important to be aware of. So loft, if you have especially complex profiles, you can combine them in a somewhat smooth shape. And then sweep, if you have a path or a line that you want to follow and a shape, you can sweep the profile along the path. More creation features. So these are patterns and mirrors. So up above is a rectangular pattern where we took that intersected part from before and we made 3 copies of it in each direction. Then we have a circular pattern. So this is a cylinder that has been patterned around its base. On path, we're selecting a source thing to pattern, and then we're giving it whatever path. So in this case, it's a spline, but you can use lines, you can use arcs. And then we have mirror. So mirror combined with circular is one of the most powerful options, because if you have something which is, let's say, 6-fold symmetry, it's the same part 6 times, you design 1/2 of 1/6. So 1/12 of your overall part. And then you can mirror it, and then you can do a circular pattern. And it allows you to do a lot less work to get parts that are more robust in design. Another thing to be aware of when you're doing patterning is, what do you want to select, a body or a feature? If you select if you have a complicated part, so something with a lot of detail, something that was intersected and then combined and then filleted, you probably want to do selecting the body. That way you just take all that detail that you have and you pattern it. If you have something that's more simple, so like you cut a hole in a part, you might just want to pattern that feature to all the spots that you want it. And then other things, faces and components, these are a bit more advanced to use, but you can pattern faces, you can pattern components, yeah. Modification features. So coming back to fillet and chamfer. So a fillet is rounding an edge, a chamfer is beveling an edge. For these two, like I said before, it's best to do them in 3D rather than in the sketch. We also have offset face and press pull. So offset face is basically what it sounds like. It is displacing a face of your part. Press pull is a combination of offset face and fillet, depending on what you select. And it is a super powerful tool for adding tolerances or clearance to your part. So especially when you're designing for 3D printing, parts aren't exact, and if you want them to slide, you want it to be a little bit of space in between them. You can design the parts at the exact same size, and then you can use press pull to add 0.2 to 0.8 millimeters of space in between your parts in order to get to the exact dimension that you actually want to print them at. Next is more modification features. So combine. So combine is 3 different really smaller commands. So it's cut, join, or intersect. Join is pretty obvious that you have like in this case, it's 2 helixes and a cylindrical base that you're joining it all together. For cut, this is a swept profile that is being cut, and then it is patterned and mirrored to make this really complicated looking design on the cylinder. And then last but not least is intersect, which allows you to do stuff like this, where you have a top view of your part and a side view of your part, and then you can intersect them and you can make fairly complicated geometry pretty quickly by using intersect. And obviously these don't have to be at 90-degree angles. You could intersect this with that and this, and you can make really complicated parts really quickly by using the combine tool. Then more modification features. So move and copy. So the move command is pretty simple with distances and angles, and you just click that checkbox if you want to make copies. And then scale is also pretty simple in that it's either uniform or non-uniform, and you can scale bodies really quickly using it. Now, this one is kind of a modification feature, but appearances. So Fusion 360 has lots of textures and appearances that are directly available in it. So plastic, wood, leather, glass, metal, all types of stuff. And you can just apply those to your parts in the render workspace, and they can look really nice without doing that much work. And then you can also modify the existing textures and add new textures to get exactly what you want in your visualization. So 3D printing. This is something that I do really often. And under the tools option in the design workspace, we have this 3D print. You can click on a body and you can see STL files are just a bunch of triangles. So for flat rectangular faces, they are just 2 triangles. For something like a cylinder, it's a lot more triangles. You can have it export to a slicing software. So if you have it already on, if you have slicing software already on your computer, you can export it, or you can just uncheck that and it'll export as an STL file. And yeah. Now on to analysis and visualization. So the measure feature, this is super useful for measuring distances and displacements. So here's an example. You can select 2 edges and find out the distance, both minimum and maximum between those edges. You can also do point-to-point measurements and then get an X, Y, and Z delta. So this breaks it up. Instead of having just, you know, a number between the 2 points, it gives you the coordinate reference for it. And then section analysis. This is useful for seeing what is happening inside more complicated designs. And we'll jump into Fusion to demonstrate these 2. So we'll close out of that, jump over here. So under this, you can see there are a lot of other analyses that you can do. Section analysis is the one that I use the most, but you can do any one of them. And they all give you different data. So here you can see we selected a face, and then we can view any cross section of the part that we want. Section analysis from this direction. That's super useful for when you have really complicated stuff with internal geometry. And then the measure tool. So we can measure these edges, and we can use that. So we'll turn XYZ delta off. So that gives us 10 as our minimum distance. It also gives you a bunch of information about the stuff that you select when you use the measure tool. Now we can do show snap points. So now, like when I go onto this surface, you can see there's a snap in the middle, and then I can snap down to this corner. So this shows me the absolute distance between them, and I want XYZ delta. So this gives me different information that's still really useful. All right. A bunch of other quality of life things in Fusion. So the model toolbox shortcut is the S key, and the model toolbox is super powerful. It gives you command searching, gives you easy access to the commands that you want to use frequently. So if we hit S, that brings up the design shortcuts, and you can see there's a bunch of commands that I use frequently that I've pinned here. So let's say I want to add shell to this list. This is the shell command. I can click this arrow, and now it's up here. I can also just type in shell and then hit enter, and that opens the shell command. And then I can go ahead and use it on the part. But this is super powerful for when you are using a lot of the same commands, or if you don't want to take the time to come up to this toolbar and then do the drop down and then go down to whatever your thing is. You know, if you know that you want offset face, you can just look up offset face and then use it. So that is the model toolbox. Another great thing about the model toolbox is it changes based on what you're doing. So if I create a sketch, let's say there, and now I hit S, it now has all my sketch shortcuts. So it's smart in that way that it recognizes what you're doing and changes to meet the thing that you're doing. Make sure the axis is up. So some people may be used to having X, Y as the flat plane in front of them and Z as being the axis coming towards them. But in machining and in the world of CAD, X, Y is a flat surface that you're working on, and then Z is up off from that flat surface. So if we go into preferences and then modeling orientation, Z up. Okay, we're gonna stay in preferences. The other thing that I do a lot is I will put 2, 3, 4 multiple profiles into one sketch, or multiple things in one sketch that I want to use, or I'll put things in one sketch that I want to use multiple times. And by default, Fusion will auto hide sketch on feature creation. Because I have multiple things in one sketch, I like to uncheck this option. you can kind of see how you use Fusion and decide whether or not you want to have that checked. But if you do have multiple things in one profile, this can make it a lot easier. Going into visualization stuff, if you want to hide or show something, it's super easy. You just need to hit the little eye next to it. So like for sketches, that's just that. So that's quality of life stuff for Fusion 360. And then questions and also feedback. And that is the end of the recorded workshop. If you have any questions or you'd like to give feedback, if anything stood out to you, make sure to leave a comment with that stuff. We'd love to hear it. And look forward to the next video in this workshop series.